Hi, all. Welcome to week one. This week, we're just setting the boundaries for our class. So, this short lecture is called What is Rhetoric? A Short Introduction to a Complex Concept. When we think about what is rhetoric, we're going to think about a few things to kind of guide our discussion. First, we're going to think about how we define rhetoric. Second, some uses of rhetoric. And third, some key concepts I want you to keep in mind as we complete these initial readings in the course. The most typical classical definition of rhetoric is borrowed from Aristotle, who hopefully you've heard of. He's had a huge influence on Western thought and Western culture, both in rhetoric and, of course, philosophy, among many other things. So Aristotle basically defines rhetoric as the art of persuasion through effective speaking. So it's important to know, classically, we want to think about rhetoric as primarily an oral concern, teaching people how to speak in ways that they can effectively achieve what they want with their audience. How can they persuade people to do what they want them to do? Right? How can we do this effectively? And teachers like Aristotle took in students to train them to become effective speakers and therefore effective citizens in a Greek democracy. So ways in which, or places in which people might need to speak might be things like the courts, the Senate, and of course in other public settings like ceremonies. But that's not normally what people think about when they hear the word rhetoric nowadays, right? So a perfect example of the way lots of people think about rhetoric in contemporary society is this cartoon. If I'm elected, everything will be wonderful, right? We think about rhetoric largely in a political setting in contemporary society. And what comes with that then is this idea that rhetoric is somehow false or empty. It's a mere rhetoric. People aren't really saying or doing anything. Instead, politicians are using words to effectively trick their audiences. So Baldwin Spencer is famous for saying, there comes a time when what is needed is not just rhetoric, but boots on the ground. This is the idea, right? That rhetoric is empty. It's the opposite of action. Rhetoric is without substance. Rhetoric is just talking to deceive people or to hide truth and to avoid action. This is not a new idea. It's not a new critique of rhetoric, though. John Locke, during the Enlightenment, wrote that defined rhetoric as that powerful instrument of error and deceit. Right? Once again, the idea that the way we express things can be separated from the content of what we're saying, and if we can explain something, persuade in particular ways, we don't have to be doing it for the right reason or to achieve a real or right goal. Instead, we might use it to trick people and deceive people, or to hide errors, or to push forward an idea as if it is true, even when we know it's not, right? But that is not a new idea. It wasn't a new idea even in the Enlightenment. In the classical period, Plato has Socrates say in the Gorgias, rhetoric is to justice what cookery is to medicine. In other words, he separates the idea of rhetoric, something that can be, that's language that can be used in particular ways, from the core idea of what you might want to achieve in a court, which would be justice, right? That instead, if we always think that the case is won by the better rhetor, the better speaker, the better orator, then what we've done is a disservice to the good, to that is just, that is right. And that's a critique from Plato, right? Because Plato says what we want is medicine that will heal us, not kind of claims about foods that will somehow make us better or make us healthy, right? And in the same way, what we really want is justice, not the person with the best use of language to convince us, in some cases, against that is just. So we have this idea of like rhetoric as something that is external or disconnected from ideas and thought, and something that can then therefore be exploited to actually confuse people, to once again to deceive, to hide the truth, to avoid action. But not all classical rhetoricians thought in this way. So when Plato has Socrates express that concern about rhetoric in the Gorgias, he is referring to a group of competitor teachers to Socrates who are known as the Sophists. Sophist meaning wise man. And the Sophists, according to Plato's description, were those teachers who taught that kind of rhetoric that is really just about winning the argument, being the most persuasive, and not worrying about what is right or good or just. And this is famously stated in a fragment from Protagoras, one of the sophists, that says, making the worse appear the better is one of the ways in which we can use rhetoric, right? So exactly doing the thing that is worse rather than the thing that is better and convincing other people of that. Plato recognized that rhetoric is the art of enchanting the soul. And so that is dangerous, of course, because we can enchant the soul to do things the soul shouldn't do, right? To effectively make choices against one's best interest or against the good, against the right, against the just. But we see Plato suggesting that there might be ways in which rhetoric could be used positively as long as it's the counterpart of dialectic, which is the philosophical search for the truth, right? So if rhetoric can be used for bad things, it could also be used to persuade people to make the right choices, to help people understand what is the right choice, what is the just choice, what is the good. Aristotle hangs on to this and wants to connect your argument to clear reason, but recognizes that there is more than just reason in persuasion. And persuasion also includes concerns about the ethos of the speaker and about moving the audience through emotion. So Aristotle famously says it's the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. In other words, if we can study what's going on, who is the audience, who is the speaker, what is the message, we can figure out through rhetoric the best way and most effective way to persuade that audience in that situation. Cicero, likewise, wants to connect what the speaker knows with how the speaker expresses that. So rhetoric, he says, unites wisdom and eloquence. We've moved into Rome now, carried over the ideas of Aristotle. And finally, we have famously in ancient Rome, Quintilian, who calls rhetoric the art of the good man speaking well. And here we see that for the Romans, rhetoric becomes part of what it means to be a good statesman, a good citizen, and part of that is being a good person. And being a good person means knowing what you're talking about, but also being a person of morals and goodness and right, and being able to express it in ways that will convince others. But of course, as we move forward, rhetoric moves away from just oratory, just the way we speak, and focuses more on the way we write. As we become more literate society, more texts are written, more communications are written, more audiences are readers. And how does that change how we think about rhetoric? Well, we think about rhetoric as something that was public and persuasive and contextual in the classical period, right? We introduced to that, of course, reason, scientific modernism, ideas of objectivity, universality, and the Enlightenment. Teaching changes the way we think about what is the purpose of rhetoric, what are we hoping to achieve in the 20th century, what do we mean by a good man, and what do we mean by how that good man should interact in society. And so in the 1960s, we have, of course, a lot of political movements in the United States that rely a lot on public rhetoric with the rise of different kinds of mass media, not just the radio, but then television, and then now, of course, into internet and social media. And so we think about rhetoric in different ways, but essentially, if we follow Nichols, a means of so ordering discourse as to produce an effect on the listener or reader. In other words, figuring out how we want to say what we want to say to get the effect we want from our audience. Or as Kenneth Burke says, the use of language as a symbolic means of inducing cooperation in beings that by nature respond to symbols. Burke is very interested in the fact that language is symbolic and that humans are symbol using animals. It's our greatest tool, according to Burke. It allows us to communicate and understand the world in much bigger ways. Bryant simplifies it by saying the function of adjusting ideas to people and of people to ideas. So the idea now is, if you think about it, right, we not only can change how we talk to different audiences to get them to see our point and accept our point and perhaps be persuaded to do something or think something, but also over time to actually change those people so that they perceive and follow the ideas that you want them to see, right? So we can see something like this in any democratic society where we start to talk about, right, that democracy is this ideal, and people who believe they're part of that democracy then will accept certain ideas connected to the ideas of democracy, right? So the power of rhetoric, not only to convince people to accept ideas, but also to change people in ways that make those ideas easier for larger groups to accept without persuasion. So working in this class, I want you to think about the many ways we can think about rhetoric. So rhetoric is the discipline that deals with understanding strategies used in the production of and consumption of communication. Okay, so rhetoric is the field we're studying right now. Strategies, what people can do, right? Can intentionally do in the production of communication, right? So in creating text and making speeches, in designing memes, making videos, whatever, right? But also we can learn strategies as we consume that communication to help us break down and understand the rhetoric. That rhetoric could be, those messages can be spoken, written, visual, multimodal, right? There are lots of different ways we get communication nowadays. And it's always purpose driven to achieve particular purposes. Things like to inform, to persuade, to motivate, I should say to teach, and so on. And then with an audience, whether that audience is made up of one person or a group of people, particularly within a context. That is, we should also be aware that our communication not only happens between a speaker and a listener, or a writer and a reader, but also that text is produced and consumed in specific contexts that may impact the way that they are produced and the way that they are received by the audience. So some key concepts I want you to think about as we read, especially these early Greek rhetoricians. Oratory and the orator or speaker, right? So what do we mean by oratory, right? What do we mean by this field of study that's focused on speaking? But also, what do these what do these people we're reading from think an orator or speaker should do or is responsible for? What is their maybe ethical responsibility in a given, or their role in any given situation? A rhetor and a rhetorician. A rhetor is somebody who uses rhetoric. So an orator would use rhetoric, a writer would use rhetoric. A rhetorician is someone who studies rhetoric, right? So think about how these things are different. Studies and or teaches rhetoric. So we're going to read texts from a number of different teachers of rhetoric, people who had schools to help other people become stronger orators. The difference between rhetoric then and philosophy and dialectic. This becomes important because the people we're reading are not just interested in how we express ideas, but also how we develop those ideas and which ideas are good. What is the good? What is the right? What is the just? What should we do or should we not do? These are things we are interested in exploring philosophically, but also rhetorically, and how do those things intersect? Ethics. What is the responsibility of the speaker? What is and the rhetor and the writer, to language, to their audience, to their society? And finally, how does rhetoric change, or does it change, or should it change, or what do these writers say about the difference between oratory and writing, and particularly speech writing or logography? Okay, so of course we're just getting started. This is a really quick overview. Watch the other videos in this section, read the assignments, and share your thoughts in this week's assignments, which focuses on a discussion board, right? If you have any questions, please contact me. I am here to help.